Hello and welcome back to Parc Fermé Parlay with Kieran Downey. We are here today to discuss the very controversial topic of the FIA's new guidelines that have been released. This is not the topic that I thought we were going to be discussing today. I thought we were going to be getting into some predictions for 2025, but no. We're here to discuss the FIA and some of the madness that they have put in to the International Sporting Code. Now, the new guidelines have been made public with the release of the FIA's 2025 International Sporting Code and are part of Appendix B, which used to be the sort of FIA's Code of Good Conduct, and it is now where the stewards' penalties for breaching the sporting code lie. Now, before we dive right into it, as I said, this is quite a controversial topic. A lot of people are not happy with the new guidelines. The FIA, specifically the president of the FIA, Mohammed bin Sulayem, is facing quite the backlash. There's been no word from any of the teams or the drivers about any of this. I imagine we'll get something at some point, assuming through the GPDA, but we'll come on to all of that later. We're going to dive in to the new guidelines. There has been 5 specific items listed in the new document outlining the prescribed penalties for breaches to the various entries in Article 12.2.1 of the International Sporting Code. For instance, one of the new guidelines, which I believe all of these apply to drivers, team principals, team officials, all this kind of stuff. It is a breach of the rules to cause moral injury or loss to the FIA or its officials. Now, this is a breach of subsection F in the ISC, and it carries a first offence penalty of a fine of €10,000. Now, it's also outlined in the documents that there are multipliers to these fines and penalties, and these multipliers are applied to the base fine and are dependent on the competition level, with a specific tier for Formula One and its participants. Now, if you are a driver in Formula One, it means that the base fine is multiplied by 4, which means if we go back to the example of causing moral injury to the FIA or its officials, as an F1 driver, it is supposed to carry a penalty of €40,000 on its first offence. 40 grand. Now, the reason I say first offence is because these punishments actually increase the more that you offend. So, for instance, that particular offence, the causing moral injury or loss to the FIA or its officials, if you do that again, for the second time, you get an €80,000 fine and a suspended 1-month suspension. If you breach that guideline again, it is a €120 fine for a third offence and an actual 1-month suspension and a deduction of an unspecified amount of championship points. The fact that we're now looking at deduction of championship points baffles me. The same penalty structure also applies to any public incitement of violence or hatred, as well as misconduct defined by Article 20 of the International Sporting Code. Now, misconduct is understood in particular, but not limited to, as the general use of language that is offensive, insulting, coarse, rude, or abusive, and acts of assault or incitement to acts that fall into either of the previous 2 categories. I feel like a lot of this is just an extension and a sort of carrying on some of the rules that were starting to be put into place last year, with the real sort of clamping down on swearing. If you remember back in 24, Max Verstappen had to do community service, and I believe he also had to pay a fine for swearing during a press conference. Charles Leclerc had to pay a fine for swearing during a press conference. He didn't have to do anything else because he did apologise immediately. But it does feel like it is just an extension of these rules that have been put in. I think they're also trying to clamp down on backlash from the drivers and that towards the stewards, specifically when you've got drivers like Max Verstappen calling the stewards stupid idiots. I think that is kind of invoked this change to the guidelines. In terms of the sort of comments that are abusive or sort of insulting towards the FIA or its officials, such as Max's sort of stupid idiots comment, I do believe that there should be some form of punishment. If you look at other sports such as the NFL, they have rules and guidelines and punishments in place for misconduct against the officials. And I think it's a fairly natural thing to have in any sort of sport. I'll come back to the NFL in a minute, but Martin Brundle made a very good comment where if you look at rugby players, they're always really respectful of the referee. And I completely agree. I think there needs to be a level of respect from the competitors within a sport to the governing bodies and the officials of that sport. In terms of the swearing, my feelings on it are kind of twofold. I do believe that there is no place for swearing or any sort of foul language in a live press conference. However, in terms of what's in the car, when the drivers are in the car, I'm not that bothered if there's a radio message comes up and one of the drivers is swearing. We've spoke about swearing before when it was kind of introduced when Max got his community service punishment. And it's obvious that the FIA have a clear issue with it. And as I said, I have no issue with enforcing punishment for somebody swearing during a live press conference. I'm all for that. I'm with you. And when Martin Brundle, I think it was on Sky Sports, he was doing an interview and he'd said, drivers are role models, and 100% they are role models to younger drivers coming up through the ranks, from karting to drivers in the junior series, the feeder series, all that kind of stuff. These ones at the pinnacle of motorsport in Formula One, they are a role model. Should they be effing and blinding in a press conference or an official media setting? No. I think the difference is when you're in the car, these drivers are on a knife edge. They are so filled with emotion and adrenaline and joy, despair, like all these different emotions. And I don't know about you, but whenever I get really worked up, I probably let a wee swear word out. We all do it pretty much, let's be honest. So in the sort of situation in the cars, I'm not that bothered if a wee radio message pops up and Yuki Tsunoda is giving it F in this and F in that, or Verstappen's giving it F in this and F in that. I'm not that bothered by that. I do think when the radio message pops up and it's Max Verstappen calling the stewards a stupid idiot, that's different. But if it's just a wee swear word, I'm not that bothered. Now, I will say the difference with the swearing sort of during a race, Formula One is in complete control over what gets shown on the broadcast. When we hear these radio messages, they're not live. There is a bit of a delay between that radio message and it being played on our screens during the broadcast. Formula One is in control over what radio messages we get to listen to. If there is such an issue with the swearing during a race or whatever, just don't play the radio message. Just don't play it. It's not that big of a problem. It doesn't seem like Formula One has any issue with it. It doesn't seem like anybody really has that much of a problem. Formula One has YouTube videos dedicated. Formula One shows us the radio messages. As I said, I'm all for clamping down on swearing in live official press conferences, but within the cars, I'm not bothered. I also think, Martin Brundle said that if you take rugby players, for example, they are always really respectful of the referee. Correct. The big difference between all of these other sports and Formula One is we don't get to hear rugby players on the pitch. We don't get to hear football players on the pitch. We don't hear these people's conversations between officials in their teams. We don't hear them talking. They're not mic'd, whereas Formula One drivers are. I think if you were to mic a football player and listen to what they say on the pitch during the game, you probably hear a lot worse than what you hear an F1 driver saying. Again, I think if you were to go into a cool down room after a rugby match, you'd hear some pretty mental language, let's be completely honest. So as I said, I'm not that bothered by the swearing during a race. As I said, I don't think there's any place for it during live press conferences, and that I'm all for clamping down on. Also, I want to just quickly jump back to the NFL comment I made about them having fines for misconduct against officials. The big difference there between the NFL and what's happening right now with the FIA and Formula One is the NFL and the NFL Players Association came to an agreement on the fines and the misconduct and everything like that. There was some form of communication between the governing body of the sport and the players of the sport and the teams of the sport. That hasn't happened in this case. The FIA have just pushed it through, and I'll come on to that in a little bit because the way it's been pushed through is also what is causing a lot of controversy. Now, just quickly on one of the other guidelines. So one of them being the general making and display of political, religious and personal statements or comments notably in violation of the general principle of neurality promoted by the FIA unless previously approved in writing are forbidden. Now, if you do breach this guideline, you are fined and penalised in the exact same way as the previous ones we've just spoken about, with the fines and how F1 drivers have to pay more, and it, tots up the more you do it. You also have to give a public apology and a repudiation of comment. Honestly, can't believe it. Am I surprised at this one? No, not particularly. I have to say that the neutrality thing, it doesn't really bother me in terms of the sort of political side. It is something that the FIA have always really pushed towards. I do find it funny that the drivers are being held to a standard in terms of neutrality in their political beliefs when the FIA President, Ben Sulayem, invited presidential candidate Donald Trump to the Miami Grand Prix last year. Whatever your feelings on Trump are, I don't really care. He can personally invite somebody to watch this race who is a pretty controversial political candidate, but the drivers are not allowed to say anything. It's the same as Sky Sports commentator Danica Patrick. She can make hints at her political beliefs, but the drivers are not allowed to express theirs. Seems a little bit hypocritical, but there we are. Now, in terms of the personal statements, I'm assuming it is a direct response to things like the love is love and the sort of pride statements that drivers like Lewis Hamilton has made, or the sort of mental health talk that Lando Norris has made, or the sort of racism that all the drivers are really fighting against. A part of me wonders if it is just because Formula One is racing in countries where it is illegal to be homosexual, or these kind of things that the FIA is trying to not upset these governments. Part of me wonders if this is very similar to like Meta when they removed their policing of, calling gay people mentally ill, that kind of stuff. They're sort of appeasing new political administrations. I don't know, so I can't comment on that. As I said, I'm not fully surprised by this one, especially I think back to 2022 when Mohammed bin Sulayem made a statement, I believe it was to Sports Illustrated, where he'd said Niki Lauda and Alan Prost only cared about driving. Now Vettel drives a rainbow bicycle, Lewis is passionate about human rights, and Norris addresses mental health. Everybody has the right to think. To me, it's about deciding whether we should impose our beliefs in something over the sport all the time. When I look at that statement and then look at the new guidelines, I'm surprised that you can't make a display of personal statement. And by personal statement, he is talking about Lewis talking about human rights, or Lando Norris talking about mental health. And I do think it is important that the drivers of these sports do stand for, ending racism, human rights, mental health. These are people that have huge followings, and to make a stance is only going to help things get better. So I do believe it is absolute insanity. Again, the political one I think is I think it's a bit hypocritical. The personal statements one I think is just a bit off the rails. Before we continue talking about this, I also just want to say that the guidelines state that FIA stewards have the authority to decide what penalty to enforce and retain the discretion to take into account any mitigating or aggravating circumstances, as well as the nature and the location of the event. I'm going to use this example twice actually, but say we've obviously seen Lewis Hamilton racing with a pride helmet, love is love, that kind of thing. If he races with that in Britain, and it's obviously legal in Britain to be gay, no big issue, you're absolutely fine. Is that penalty going to be enforced there because of location? It's actually all right, no worries. Then say we go to Saudi Arabia and he wears the exact same helmet, or the UAE and he wears the exact same helmet. Is he then liable to face a punishment because of the location of where the sport happens to be racing? that weekend. I have to say, it's only January. We still have a month and a half, I believe, until the season starts, and this is only going to create huge animosity between the drivers and the FIA. I can see it happening already. These rules feel very draconian, and I have to say, I do believe that you should be able to speak out against the governing body as long as you're not being rude or insulting. I don't believe that any governing body or anything should go completely unchecked. There should be some form of, well, actually, no, we don't think that's right, but here's why. Not, again, as I said, no insulting or any sort of offensive behaviour. It does feel incredibly controlling, and it almost feels like the drivers are receiving some form of gag order, that they are not allowed to speak out, they're not allowed to say anything, they're not allowed to have any thoughts or feelings on anything. They are there purely to race. It's what Ben Slyon believes. They are there to race. They are not allowed to have any form of opinion or anything. They're not allowed to say anything. It is basically a shut up and drive your car. As I said, the way it was put through as well is also incredibly worrying. I would say there was no communication with any of the stakeholders or the GPDA or even the FIA's own drivers' commission. It was pushed through on a snap electronic vote, and that's how these guidelines come into place. There is actually a meeting of the World Motorsport Council, I believe it's called, in February, which means that they could all have had an open and frank and honest conversation about this and really gotten everybody's thoughts and feelings on it and made any amendments they needed to make and then sort of pushed it through before the F1 season starts. It's wild that it's come out now, and it does seem like a direct target, I feel like, of Formula One and its drivers, specifically the drivers like Max Verstappen, who likes to be quite vocal, or Lewis Hamilton, that likes to put, you know, the end racism and the love is love, that likes to have these sort of statements, and I'm all for it. I don't know why Salayam has focused specifically on these areas. As I said, with the sort of political stuff, he's always sort of maintained that sports should have some kind of neutrality. I do think, again, it's quite hypocritical because he himself does not have any form of neutrality. It's quite funny that, isn't it? I don't know why he's so hampered on swearing. As I said, I agree that there's no place for it in official or live press conferences, but as I said, there is a lot of raw emotion happening within the sport 90% of the time when the cars are out on track. And I do think that they have to be careful, because if they literally slap tape over the drivers' mouths and they silence it so much and they get they pull all of the raw emotion out of the sport that we all love so much, people will just turn off to it. Like this, people just choose to watch something else. They just won't watch F1 on a Sunday, and it will begin to affect the sport. And there's just a fine line, and I feel like they've gone a bit too far to one side. I also think that there is a lot of ambiguity within the new guidelines. I think some of them are quite far-reaching. And considering, you know, race bans and a deduction of championship points is on the table and is a very real punishment that these drivers might get, the fact that it is quite open to what one person deems to be rude or offensive, that may not be universally held. So it's going to be quite difficult to enforce, or enforce and not receive any form of backlash. As I said, there's also a huge amount of ambiguity. Going back to the pride flag example that I used, say somebody is wearing a pride flag inspired helmet, would that be deemed inappropriate and offensive? Because in some cultures, it would be. Would it also be deemed a political and personal statement? Because I imagine they would deem it as that. So then what is the punishment? Are they being punished for a personal statement, a political statement, being inappropriate and offensive because of where they are in the world culturally? Is it all four of them? Does that mean they get whatever the fine is times 4 because they're an F1 driver, and suddenly they're paying like $1,500 in fines? I've heard a lot of the statements from the sort of FIA officials or Ben Slime himself when they say that these guidelines are supposed to make everything more transparent. And I feel like all it's done is just make everything more opaque. There's been no response to this from anyone within Formula One, no response from Formula One themselves. I imagine they'll just get on with it. There's been no response from any of the teams or any of the drivers. I have a feeling there is probably a GPDA statement on its way. I would also love nothing more than if all the teams put out one of them joint statements. Remember last year when somebody said something that Susie Wolff and Toto were, passing information to one another, and Susie Wolff got the brunt of it, and it was apparently one of the teams, and all the teams put out a joint message at the exact same time being like, nothing to do with us. I'm going to need something like that to say, this is a bit extreme. It's clear that these guidelines are here to rein in the driver's behaviour, and all it's going to do is increase animosity. It's very clear that Ben Slime just wants these drivers to shut up, race their cars, bend the knee, be quiet, race your car. And I just don't think these drivers are going to settle for that. Lewis Hamilton's not going to settle for that. Max Verstappen is not going to settle for that. Sebastian Vettel, when he was racing, wouldn't have settled for it. Max Verstappen has already said that he is growing tired of Formula One's overburdened regulations, and this will probably feel like another slap in the face. Is it enough for him to call time on being a Formula One driver? I don't know, only time will tell, we'll have to wait and see. But however, these new guidelines could seriously destabilise an already rapidly decreasing relationship between F1, specifically the drivers, and the governing body, the FIA. And that is everything from us on the new FIA guidelines. It'd be interesting to see if we get anything from the GPDA, if the teams have anything to say about it, and how long this will continue to go on. I've seen many sound bites or little statements from the BBC specifically that have said they were speaking to somebody within the FIA, and Salayam is running it very much like a dictatorship. Some of these drivers, as I said, will just not put up with it. Max Verstappen's not going to change just because he's going to get fined. Lewis Hamilton is not going to continue fighting for human rights or wearing a pride helmet and fighting for what he believes in. Lando Norris is not going to stop talking about mental health because of these fines. I think it is just going to be a complete and utter mess. So we'll see what happens there, but what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on the new guidelines. That is everything from us. We'll be back very soon when we start getting into some predictions for the 2025 season. It is getting ever so close, and I'm getting very, very excited, but I'll see you very soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Love you. Bye.